Welcome to Revenge Room, where the quietest family betrayals are finally brought into the light. And before we begin, remember the title of today's story. My son told me to shut up at Christmas. I took the keys and walked out, because one sentence spoken at a Christmas table was enough to shatter a lifetime of sacrifice and set in motion a chain of consequences no one saw coming. If you have ever been dismissed by the very people you gave everything to, if you have ever felt the sting of humiliation inside your own family, then stay with me, because this is not just another family drama. This is a slow-burning descent into betrayal, silence, and reckoning. Tonight, I will tell you the story of a widowed father who was pushed to the edge, not by strangers, but by the people who should have protected him. A story where disrespect turns into exile, and where walking away becomes the most dangerous move of all. This is not a loud revenge filled with shouting or violence. It is a calculated, deeply human reckoning built on patience, memory, and the kind of quiet strength that comes from being underestimated. I promise you that if you stay until the very end, you will witness unexpected twists, moments that will make you hold your breath, and a resolution that delivers a powerful sense of justice and emotional release. This story is about power, shifting hands, about arrogance collapsing under its own weight, and about a final outcome so satisfying that it will linger with you long after the video ends. Nothing here is accidental. Every word, every choice, every silence carries meaning, so settle in, listen closely, and prepare yourself. Because once this story begins, there is no turning back. And by the time it ends, you will understand why sometimes the most devastating revenge is simply knowing when to walk away and letting the truth do the rest. My name is Arthur Bennett. I spent 40 years as a financial consultant helping families protect what they had built, and I retired early to care for my wife Evelyn during her final battle with cancer. She passed 2 years ago, and since then, I've lived quietly in the same house where we raised our son, surrounded by her photographs and the garden she loved. Christmas had always been Evelyn's favorite holiday. She would spend weeks planning the menu, arranging the decorations, filling every corner of our home with warmth and light. After she was gone, I tried to keep the tradition alive. I told myself it was for Caleb, my only son. But the truth is, I did it for her. I did it because somewhere in my heart, I believed she was still watching, and I could not bear to let her down. This year, I woke before dawn to start the turkey. I made her cornbread stuffing from the recipe card she had written in her own hand. The ink faded, but still legible after 30 years. I set the table with the good china, the set we had received as a wedding gift and used only on special occasions. By the time Caleb and his wife Lydia arrived, the house smelled exactly the way it had when Evelyn was alive. For a moment, just one moment, I let myself believe things might be different this year. They were not. Lydia walked in without greeting me. She glanced at the decorations, the table, the food I had spent all day preparing, and her only response was to pull out her phone and start scrolling. Caleb followed behind her, carrying a bottle of wine that I suspected Lydia had chosen. He nodded at me but didn't meet my eyes. I noticed that immediately. My son was not looking at his wife for guidance. He was looking away from me entirely, as if the sight of my face caused him physical discomfort. At the time, I did not understand why. I would learn the truth much later, and it would break something inside me that I did not know could still break. We sat down to eat. I said grace, the same simple prayer Evelyn and I had spoken together for over 4 decades. Lydia did not bow her head. Caleb bowed his, but kept his eyes open, staring at his plate. When I finished, Lydia reached for the turkey before I had even picked up my fork. The first comment came within minutes. She poked at the stuffing and said it was a little dry, then added that she supposed traditional recipes did not always translate well to modern tastes. I said nothing. A few minutes later, she mentioned that the cranberry sauce was too tart and asked if I had considered buying the canned version like normal people. I said nothing. Then she looked around the dining room and remarked that the wallpaper was looking dated, that perhaps it was time to consider some updates now that I was living here alone and did not really need all this space. I watched my son through all of this. Each time Lydia spoke, Caleb flinched, his jaw tightened, his fork paused halfway to his mouth. But he never said a word. He never defended me. He never asked her to stop. He simply sat there, shrinking into himself as if hoping that by staying silent, he could disappear from the conversation entirely. I decided to try something simple. I turned to Caleb and asked how his work was going. It was an innocent question, the kind of thing a father asks a son over dinner. Before he could answer, Lydia cut in with something about how stressful his job had been and how he did not need to discuss it during the holidays. I waited for her to finish, then looked at my son again. I kept my voice calm and steady. I said I was asking my son, not her. The table went silent. Caleb finally looked at me, and for 1 second, I thought I saw something in his eyes. Guilt, shame, maybe even an apology forming on his lips. But then his expression hardened, and what came out of his mouth was something I will never forget. He said just, "Shut up, Dad." He asked if we could have one dinner without my lectures. I did not raise my voice. I didn't argue. I simply set my napkin beside my plate and looked at him for a long moment. Then I stood, reached into my pocket, and pulled out my keys. Without a word, I walked toward the front door. My hand was steady as I reached for the doorknob. Behind me, I heard Lydia's chair scrape against the floor. Her voice followed me across the room, sharp and dripping with something that sounded almost like triumph. She said if I walked out that door, I should not expect anything from them. She said they had done enough for me. I paused for just a moment, not because her words wounded me, but because I wanted to remember them exactly as she spoke them. I wanted to hold on to that sentence so I would never forget what my son's wife truly thought of me. I had housed them for 3 years. I had never charged them a penny of rent. I had paid for repairs, covered utilities during the months when Caleb was between jobs, and never once asked for gratitude. And in her mind, they had done enough for me. I did not turn around. I did not offer a rebuttal or demand an apology. I simply opened the door, stepped out into the cold Colorado night, and let it close behind me with a soft click. The sound was quieter than I expected. Somehow that made it feel more final. The snow had started falling while we were eating dinner. A thin white layer already covered my car and the walkway leading to the street. I brushed off the windshield with my bare hand, not bothering to go back for gloves. The cold felt appropriate. It matched something inside me that had frozen the moment my son told me to shut up at his own Christmas table. I started driving with no destination in mind. The streets were nearly empty, most families tucked inside their warm homes, celebrating the holiday together. I passed houses with glowing windows and Christmas trees visible through curtains. I saw a father carrying a sleeping child from a car to a front door. I saw an elderly couple walking arm in arm down a shoveled sidewalk. Each image felt like a small wound, a reminder of what I had lost and what had been taken from me. Evelyn's voice came to me as I drove. It often did in moments like this when the silence grew heavy and my thoughts turned inward. I remembered a conversation we had about 3 years before she died, not long after Caleb announced his engagement to Lydia. We were sitting on the back porch watching the sunset over the mountains, and Evelyn had been unusually quiet all evening. When I asked what was bothering her, she hesitated before answering. She said there was something about Lydia that unsettled her. She said the girl knew how to talk to old people too well, like she had done it before, like it was a skill she had practiced and refined. At the time, I dismissed her concern. I told her she was being overprotective, that Lydia was simply polite and well-mannered. Evelyn did not argue with me. She rarely did when she knew I was not ready to hear the truth. She just nodded and changed the subject, but I noticed she never fully warmed to Lydia after that. She was cordial, always gracious, but there was a distance she maintained that I never understood until now. I wish I had listened. I wish I had asked her to explain what she meant. But Evelyn was already sick by then, and I was so focused on her treatment, on making her comfortable, and holding on to every remaining moment we had together, that I let the comment fade into the background. Now it echoed in my mind like a warning I had received too late. The snow fell harder as I drove. I realized I'd been heading in a specific direction without consciously choosing it. The streets were familiar, the turns automatic, and before I fully understood where I was going, I found myself pulling up in front of Martha Quinn's house. Martha had been Evelyn's closest friend for over 30 years. They had met through a church volunteer program and had remained inseparable ever since. When Evelyn was dying, Martha visited almost every day. She brought meals, sat with Evelyn for hours, and helped me navigate the impossible maze of grief that I could feel approaching. After the funeral, Martha checked on me regularly, always with a gentle touch, never intrusive, just present. I had not planned to come here. I had not even thought of Martha when I left the house. But somehow my hands had turned the wheel, and my foot had pressed the gas, and now I was parked in front of her small brick home with its tidy garden and white picket fence. The porch light was on. That struck me as odd. It was nearly 9 o'clock on Christmas night. Most people had turned off their outside lights by now, settled in for the evening with family. But Martha's light glowed steady and bright, as if she had been expecting a visitor. I walked up the path and raised my hand to knock, but the door opened before my knuckles touched the wood. Martha stood in the doorway wearing a thick cardigan and a gentle, knowing expression. She did not seem surprised to see me. She did not ask what had happened or why I was there. She simply said that Evelyn had told her I would come eventually. The words hit me like a physical blow. My wife had been gone for 2 years, and yet somehow she had anticipated this moment. She had known something would break. Something would finally push me out the door, and she had prepared for it in ways I was only beginning to understand. Martha stepped aside to let me in, and as I crossed the threshold, my eyes fell on something resting on the hallway table. It was a sealed envelope slightly yellowed with age, and across the front was handwriting I would recognize anywhere. Evelyn's elegant script spelled out 5 words that made my heart stop. For Arthur when he is ready. I stared at the envelope for a long time before picking it up. Martha did not rush me. She simply placed a cup of tea in my hands and sat quietly in the chair across from me, waiting. She understood perhaps better than anyone that some moments require silence. Evelyn had chosen her confidant well. When I finally broke the seal and unfolded the letter inside, my hands were trembling, not from age, not from cold, but from the weight of holding something my wife had written, knowing I would read it after she was gone. The paper smelled faintly of the lavender sachets she used to keep in her desk drawer. Even in death, she found ways to remind me she was still there. But before I share what the letter said, I need to explain something about who I am. Or rather, who I was before I became the quiet old man my daughter-in-law believed she could manipulate. For 40 years, I worked as a financial consultant, not the flashy kind you see on television, the ones with expensive suits and corner offices in Manhattan skyscrapers. I was the other kind, the methodical kind, the kind who sat across kitchen tables from ordinary families and helped them protect what little they had. I taught school teachers how to maximize their pensions. I helped small business owners structure their assets so a single lawsuit would not destroy everything they had built. I guided widows through the maze of paperwork their husbands had left behind, translating legal jargon into plain English so they could make informed decisions. I was never rich by the standards most people use to measure wealth. I never owned a yacht or a vacation home or a car that cost more than my first house. But I was wealthy in the way that matters. I understood money. I understood how it moved, how it could be protected, how it could disappear if you were not careful. And more importantly, I understood people. I had spent 4 decades watching families tear themselves apart over inheritance disputes, watching greedy relatives circle dying parents like vultures waiting for a meal. I knew the signs. I knew the tactics. I had seen every version of the game Lydia was trying to play. The reason I lived simply was not because I had to. It was because Evelyn asked me to. She believed that wealth displayed was wealth wasted. She wanted us to give to others to support the causes we believed in, to leave the world a little better than we found it. So we drove modest cars and wore ordinary clothes and never mentioned to anyone, including our own son, exactly how much we had accumulated over the years. It was our private matter, and we intended to keep it that way. When Evelyn got sick, I retired immediately. I didn't hesitate. Every financial principle I had ever taught others told me to keep working to maintain income streams, to prepare for the expenses that would come. But none of that mattered. My wife was dying, and I was not going to let her face it alone. I spent 18 months by her side, holding her hand through treatments, reading to her when she was too weak to hold a book, sleeping in a chair beside her hospital bed because I could not bear to be more than an arm's length away. Now, sitting in Martha's living room, I finally opened her letter and began to read. The words were written in her elegant script, the same handwriting I had seen on grocery lists and birthday cards, and the little notes she used to leave on my pillow when I was traveling for work. But these words were different. These words had been written by a woman who knew she was running out of time. She began by saying she was sorry. She said she could not warn me directly because she had no proof, only instinct. She said she had watched Lydia carefully from the first day Caleb brought her home, and something about the girl had never felt right. The way she asked questions about our finances, the way she complimented our house a little too often, the way she seemed to be taking mental inventory of everything we owned. The letter instructed me to visit our bank the next morning and ask for the safe deposit box registered in my name alone. Evelyn had set it up years ago before she got sick, before anyone could question her mental capacity or claim she was not of sound mind. Inside the box, she wrote I would find everything I needed to understand what she had done to protect me. I barely slept that night. Martha insisted I stay in her guest room, and I was too exhausted to argue. But my mind would not stop turning over Evelyn's words, trying to piece together a puzzle I did not yet fully understand. The next morning, I drove to the bank as soon as it opened. The clerk recognized my name immediately and led me to the vault without asking questions. When she left me alone with the box, I opened it slowly, half expecting to find it empty, half afraid of what I might discover inside. The contents were neatly organized exactly as Evelyn would have arranged them. Property deeds bound with a rubber band, trust documents in a manila folder, insurance policies I had never seen before, and at the bottom, a small USB drive with a single word written on the label in her handwriting: insurance. As I sorted through the documents, the truth became clear. Evelyn had restructured our assets years ago quietly and legally without ever mentioning it to me. The house where Caleb and Lydia had been living rent-free for 3 years was in my name alone. It had always been in my name alone. Lydia had no claim to it, neither did Caleb. If I chose to sell it tomorrow, there was nothing either of them could do to stop me. But it was the item at the very bottom of the box that made my breath catch in my throat. A smaller envelope sealed with red wax bearing a label in Evelyn's unmistakable handwriting. 5 words that told me this was far from over, open only with Judith Harper present. The envelope with the red wax seal sat on my kitchen table for 3 days before I found the courage to contact Judith Harper. I was not avoiding the truth. I was preparing myself for it. There is a difference, though perhaps only those who have lived through similar moments would understand. During those 3 days, I read Evelyn's first letter again and again, each time discovering new layers of meaning I had missed before. She had written it knowing that one day I would need to understand not just what she had done, but why she had done it in secret. She had protected me from knowledge that would have destroyed my relationship with my son, holding on to her suspicions alone, carrying that burden even as her body was failing her. On the second night, I found myself remembering something I had not thought about in years. A moment from 3 summers ago when Evelyn was already sick, but still mobile enough to move around the house. Caleb and Lydia had come to visit for the weekend, and I had gone to the hardware store to pick up supplies for a fence repair I had been putting off. Evelyn told me later what happened while I was gone, though at the time she framed it as casual observation rather than the warning it truly was. She had been resting in the sunroom, the door slightly open, when she heard Lydia's voice coming from the guest bedroom upstairs. Lydia was on the phone with someone speaking in a tone Evelyn had never heard her use before. Confident, cold, calculating. The words Evelyn overheard that day had stayed with her until her death. Lydia had said that once the old man was gone, the house would be theirs. She had said Caleb would not fight her, that he never fought her on anything, that she had him exactly where she wanted him. Evelyn did not confront Lydia. She did not tell me what she had heard. Instead, she began to plan. She called Judith Harper, a friend from her years volunteering at the community legal clinic, a woman who had become one of the most respected estate attorneys in Colorado. She restructured our assets quietly and legally. She created trusts and transferred deeds and built a fortress around everything we had accumulated over 40 years of marriage. But she did something else too. Something I only learned about from reading her letter more carefully on that third night. She invited Lydia for tea. Just the two of them on an afternoon when Caleb was at work and I was meeting with my accountant. Evelyn told Lydia she wanted to discuss the future, to share some thoughts about what would happen after she was gone. She said she wanted to make sure Lydia understood how much the family meant to her. Lydia, believing she was speaking to a dying woman who posed no threat, let her guard down. She talked about her plans for the house, the renovations she wanted to make, the rooms she thought were wasted on an old man living alone. She talked about Arthur's money as if it already belonged to her, as if my death was simply a formality delaying her inheritance. She never noticed the small recording device Evelyn had placed beneath a stack of magazines on the coffee table. Colorado is a one-party consent state. Evelyn had done her research. After that conversation, Evelyn asked Martha to watch over me when she was gone, not to spy, not to interfere, but to observe and document. She knew I would not see the danger until it was too late. She knew my love for Caleb would blind me to what his wife was doing. So she built a network of protection around me, a safety net I did not know existed until I fell. All of this became clear as I read the final paragraphs of her letter. She had left certain things with Judith, she wrote, recordings, documents, evidence that could not be disputed. She instructed me to use them only when I had no other choice, only when the situation had become unbearable. She didn't want to destroy my relationship with Caleb without proof. But if he ever let Lydia hurt me, if he ever stood by and watched while his wife tore me apart, then he had made his choice, and I would need to make mine. On the morning of the fourth day, I picked up the phone and dialed Judith Harper's number. She answered on the first ring, as if she had been waiting by the phone for 2 years. Her voice was calm and steady. She said she had been expecting this call since the day Evelyn passed. She said Evelyn had prepared everything organized, everything anticipated, every possible scenario. The only question that remained, Judith said, was whether I was ready to use what my wife had left behind. I told her I was ready. I told her about Christmas dinner, about Caleb's words, about Lydia's parting shot as I walked out the door. I told her I had found the safe deposit box, the documents, the USB drive labeled insurance. I told her about the smaller envelope with the red wax seal, the one I had not yet opened because it bore her name. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. When Judith spoke again, her voice had changed. It was softer now, almost hesitant, as if she was weighing whether to share something she had been holding back. She said there was more I needed to know. She said it was about Lydia, about who she was before she married my son. Judith Harper's office was located in a modest brick building on the outskirts of downtown, the kind of place you might walk past 100 times without noticing. There was no flashy signage, no marble lobby, no indication that the woman inside had spent 30 years handling some of the most complex estate cases in Colorado. Evelyn had always admired that about her. Competence without arrogance, skill without spectacle. I arrived the morning after our phone call, the envelope with the red wax seal tucked carefully in my coat pocket. Judith met me at the door herself. No receptionist, no assistant, just a silver-haired woman with sharp eyes and a handshake that meant business. She led me to a small conference room where files were already spread across the table, organized with the same meticulous care Evelyn had always applied to everything she touched. Before we opened the sealed envelope, Judith said she needed to explain exactly what my wife had put in place. She spoke slowly and clearly, the way I imagined she addressed juries when she still practiced litigation, making certain every word landed with its full weight. 2 years before her death, Evelyn had created a revocable living trust. She had transferred all of our major assets into this trust, including the house where Caleb and Lydia had been living, our investment accounts, and the life insurance policies we had maintained since our 30s. The trust was structured so that I remained the primary beneficiary with full control during my lifetime. Judith was named as the successor trustee, which meant that if anything happened to me or if I became incapacitated, she would take over management of the assets according to Evelyn's specific instructions. The most important detail Judith explained was what the trust did not include. Caleb was not named as a beneficiary, neither was Lydia. They had no legal claim to anything, not the house, not the investments, not a single dollar of what Evelyn and I had built together. If I chose to leave them something, that would be my decision to make. But as things stood, they were entitled to nothing. I sat in silence as the implications settled over me. All those years Lydia had been circling, calculating, planning her inheritance. She had been chasing a prize that did not exist. The house she coveted was never going to be hers. The money she assumed would flow to her through Caleb was protected behind legal walls she could not breach. Evelyn had seen her coming and had quietly, methodically removed every avenue of attack. But Judith was not finished. She leaned forward and told me that Evelyn had not just prepared documents, she had built a network. Martha Quinn, Judith explained, had been doing more than checking on me out of friendship. Evelyn had asked her to watch, to listen, to document anything that might be relevant if the situation ever deteriorated. Martha had kept a journal for nearly 3 years, recording every instance of cruelty she witnessed, every cutting remark Lydia made, every moment of disrespect that might otherwise have been forgotten. I felt something shift inside me as I listened. All this time I had believed I was alone. I had believed that Evelyn's death had left me unprotected, vulnerable to whatever schemes Lydia was constructing. But I had never been alone. My wife had woven a safety net around me, invisible threads connecting people who loved her and who had promised to love me in her absence. That afternoon, I drove to Martha's house. She was waiting for me just as she had been on Christmas night, as if she always knew when I was coming. We sat together in her living room, and she brought out a leather-bound journal that looked worn from frequent handling. Inside were 3 years of observations written in Martha's careful handwriting. Dates, times, locations, witnesses. The neighborhood barbecue where Lydia had called me senile within earshot of a dozen guests. The dinner party where she told friends I probably would not last another winter, laughing as if my death were a punchline. The countless small humiliations she had inflicted when she thought no one important was watching. Martha's voice was soft as she explained. Evelyn had known she was dying. She had known she would not be there to protect me herself. So she had asked Martha to be her eyes, her ears, her memory. Every cruelty that Lydia thought had disappeared into the air had instead been captured on paper, preserved as evidence of a pattern that no one could dismiss as misunderstanding or exaggeration. I thanked Martha, though the words felt inadequate. She had carried this responsibility for years without ever telling me, without ever asking for recognition. She had simply done what Evelyn asked quietly and faithfully, because that was what their friendship meant. When I returned to Judith's office the following day to open the sealed envelope, I thought I had already absorbed the worst of what Evelyn had discovered. I thought the revelations were complete. But as we broke the red wax seal together and reviewed the contents inside, Judith slid a separate folder across the table. Her expression had changed, grown more serious, more guarded. She said there was something else I needed to know. Before Lydia married Caleb, she had been married once before, to a 58-year-old widower in Nevada, a man who had owned his home outright, who had comfortable retirement savings, who had believed he was starting a new chapter with a woman who loved him. He lost everything in the divorce, every penny, every asset, every shred of dignity. And Lydia had walked away clean, ready to find her next target. The news about Lydia's first marriage should have shocked me. A part of me wished it had. But as Judith laid out the details of what had happened to that widower in Nevada, I felt something closer to confirmation than surprise. The pieces I had been collecting in my mind for months finally clicked into place, forming a picture I had suspected but refused to see clearly until now. What Judith did not know, what I had not yet told anyone, was that I had already begun preparing before Christmas. I had not been as blind as Lydia believed. I had simply been waiting, watching, giving my son every possible chance to prove me wrong. It started about 6 months ago in the summer when Lydia began asking questions she had never asked before. She wanted to know if I had updated my estate planning recently. She mentioned casually that a friend's father had developed dementia and the family had been caught off guard because no one had power of attorney. She suggested with exaggerated concern that perhaps it was time for me to consider putting Caleb's name on some of my accounts, just in case something happened just for convenience. I recognized the pattern immediately. I had spent 40 years watching families navigate these exact conversations, and I knew the difference between genuine concern and strategic positioning. A loving family member asks how you are feeling and whether you need help. A predator asks about your paperwork. I did not confront her. Confrontation would have accomplished nothing except alerting her that I was aware. Instead, I began quietly moving important documents out of the house. I gathered the originals of my deeds, my insurance policies, my investment statements, everything that might be useful to someone trying to build a case for my incompetence or to forge my signature on legal documents. I placed them in a safe deposit box at a bank across town, one where Lydia had never accompanied me, one where her name appeared on nothing. By the time Christmas arrived, I had secured everything of importance. The only things remaining in my home office were copies decoys, papers that would lead nowhere if someone went searching through my files. I had also begun paying closer attention to Caleb, looking for any sign that he understood what his wife was doing, any indication that he might still be the son I had raised rather than the puppet she had created. Christmas dinner was supposed to be his final chance. I didn't tell him that, of course. I didn't announce that I was testing him. I simply created an opportunity and waited to see what he would do with it. When I asked him about his work, I was not making conversation. I was giving him an opening to speak to me directly, father to son, without Lydia controlling the narrative. I was asking him to show me he was still in there somewhere. He failed. When he told me to shut up, when he snapped at me with anger that seemed to come from nowhere, I understood that the test was over. That was not frustration or holiday stress. That was a man who had chosen his side and resented being reminded that another side existed. My son had looked at me with something close to hatred, and I knew in that moment that Lydia had won a battle I had not even realized we were fighting. I shared all of this with Judith as we sat in her office, the folder about Lydia's past still open on the table between us. I told her I had not wanted any of this. I told her I had spent months hoping I was wrong, praying that Lydia was simply difficult rather than dangerous, wishing that my son would wake up and see what was happening before it was too late. Judith listened without interrupting. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment. Then she said something that cut straight through every defense I had built around my heart. She said Evelyn had predicted exactly this. She said my wife had told her years ago that my only weakness was my hope. I believed too strongly that people could change, that love could fix anything, that patience and grace would eventually triumph over selfishness and cruelty. Evelyn had known that this hope would paralyze me, would keep me waiting and watching long past the point when action was necessary. That was why she had prepared everything herself. She had built these protections not because she doubted my intelligence or my capability, but because she knew my heart would get in the way. I sat with those words for what felt like hours. Evelyn had loved me enough to see my flaws clearly, and she had loved me enough to compensate for them. She had not judged me for my hope. She had simply worked around it, ensuring that when hope finally failed, I would have something solid to stand on. Judith gave me time to compose myself. Then she reached into her briefcase and pulled out a formal document, crisp and official, with legal language I recognized from my years in financial consulting. She slid it across the table and explained what it was: a 30-day notice to vacate. The first step in reclaiming my property from the people who had been living there rent-free while plotting to take everything I owned. She said they were living in my house. They had been living there for 3 years, contributing nothing, planning everything. It was time they understood whose name was on the deed. It was time they learned that the old man they had dismissed and disrespected was not as helpless as they believed. I picked up the pen she offered and signed my name at the bottom of the document. My hand did not shake. My heart did not waver. Evelyn had given me the tools. Now it was my turn to use them. The certified letter was sent the following morning. Judith handled the delivery herself using a process server she trusted to document everything properly. I did not accompany them. I did not want to see my son's face when he realized what was happening. Some victories are necessary but not enjoyable, and this was one of them. I spent those first days after sending the notice staying with Martha. She insisted, and I did not argue. Her guest room had become a strange sort of sanctuary, a place where I could think clearly without being surrounded by memories of Evelyn or reminders of the family I was being forced to dismantle. Martha kept me fed, kept me company, and kept me informed. Her network of neighborhood friends proved remarkably efficient at gathering information. It was through Martha that I learned how Lydia reacted when the letter arrived. According to one of Martha's friends who lived 2 houses down from my property, Lydia had been outside checking the mail when the process server approached. She signed for the envelope without suspicion, probably assuming it was something routine. The neighbor reported that Lydia opened it right there on the sidewalk, still smiling, still confident in whatever she had been planning that day. The smile disappeared quickly. The neighbor said Lydia's face went through several transformations in the span of a few seconds. First confusion, then disbelief, then something that looked almost like amusement. She actually laughed, apparently a short, sharp sound that carried across the quiet street. But as she continued reading, as she flipped through the attached documents and saw the property deed with my name alone, as she reviewed the trust summary that mentioned her nowhere, the laughter died. What replaced it, the neighbor said, was fury. Lydia stormed back into the house, slamming the door hard enough that the neighbor heard it from her own porch. What happened inside after that, no one could say for certain. But the neighbor reported raised voices, Lydia's shrill and commanding, Caleb's lower and harder to distinguish. The argument lasted nearly an hour. I could imagine the conversation without needing to hear it. Lydia would have cycled through her usual stages. Denial, first insisting that this was impossible, that there must be some mistake, that no senile old man could have orchestrated something this sophisticated. Then fury at the audacity, at the betrayal, at the realization that she had been outmaneuvered by someone she had dismissed as irrelevant. And finally, calculation. Lydia was not the type to accept defeat. She would immediately begin strategizing, looking for weaknesses to exploit, angles to work, buttons to push. Martha's friend reported that about 2 hours after the letter arrived, she saw Lydia leave the house alone. She was dressed nicely, makeup freshly applied, carrying herself with the kind of composed determination that suggested she had already formed a plan. The neighbor did not know where Lydia went that afternoon, but I had my suspicions. She was probably consulting with someone, perhaps a lawyer of her own, perhaps a friend who had helped her navigate similar situations before. Lydia was not a woman who improvised. She researched, she prepared, she executed. What I did not learn until later through Judith's own sources was what had happened between Lydia and Caleb before she left the house that day. Apparently, there had been a moment, brief but significant, when Caleb had tried to speak. He had started to say something, his voice hesitant, his words halting, something that had been building inside him, something he had been carrying for longer than anyone knew. But Lydia had cut him off before he could finish. She had demanded to know if he was going soft on her. She had reminded him that this was their future, their security, their life together. She had asked point blank if he was with her or not. Caleb, according to what Judith later pieced together, had swallowed whatever he was about to say. He had nodded. He had chosen once again to stand beside the woman who was leading him toward destruction, rather than the father who had tried to save him. 3 days passed after the letter arrived. 3 days of silence from my son and his wife. 3 days during which I began to wonder if perhaps Lydia had accepted defeat, if perhaps she had recognized that the game was over and further resistance was futile. I should have known better. I should have remembered what Judith had told me about the widower in Nevada, about how Lydia had operated before, about the patience and persistence she brought to her schemes. On the 4th day, Martha called me into her living room with an expression I could not quite read. She pointed toward the window, and I looked outside to see a sight that made my stomach tighten. Lydia was walking up the path to Martha's front door. She was carrying a casserole dish covered in foil, the kind of offering a thoughtful neighbor might bring to someone who was ill or grieving. Her face was streaked with tears, her shoulders hunched in a posture of apparent remorse. Everything about her appearance screamed contrition, from the modest clothing to the downcast eyes to the slight tremble in her lower lip. She knocked gently, almost timidly, and when Martha opened the door, Lydia's voice came out soft and broken. She said she needed to see her father-in-law. She said she had made a terrible mistake. She said she had come to apologize, to make things right, to beg for forgiveness. Martha looked at me. I looked at Lydia. And behind those tear-filled eyes, beneath that mask of humility and regret, I saw something else entirely. I saw a predator recalculating, adjusting her approach, preparing to try a different angle of attack. She had done this before. She knew the script by heart. The only question now was whether I would play the role she expected me to play. I invited Lydia inside. Martha raised an eyebrow, but said nothing, stepping back to give us the living room while she retreated to the kitchen. I could feel her watching from the doorway, a silent witness to whatever was about to unfold. Before Lydia entered, before she even crossed the threshold, I reached into my pocket and pressed a small button on my phone. Judith had given me very specific instructions about documentation. Colorado law allows a person to record any conversation they are part of without informing the other party. I intended to use that law to its full advantage. Lydia settled onto the couch across from me, placing the casserole on the coffee table between us, like a peace offering. Her hands trembled slightly as she folded them in her lap. Her eyes were red-rimmed, her voice thick with what sounded like genuine emotion. She began speaking almost immediately, as if she had been rehearsing the words for days and could not wait any longer to deliver them. She said she knew she had made terrible mistakes. She said the stress of the past few years had changed her, made her someone she did not recognize. She talked about the pressure of caring for a home, managing finances, trying to support Caleb through his career struggles. She said she had taken her frustrations out on the wrong person, and she was ashamed of how she had treated me. Then she mentioned Evelyn. She said she knew she could never replace my wife. She said Evelyn had been a remarkable woman, and all Lydia wanted now was to honor her memory by becoming a better daughter-in-law, a better partner to Caleb, a better member of our family. Her voice broke on the word family, and she dabbed at her eyes with a tissue she had pulled from her sleeve. It was a masterful performance. Every word landed exactly where it was intended to land. Every gesture seemed calibrated to evoke sympathy and forgiveness. If I had not spent the past week learning what Judith had uncovered about Lydia's history, I might have believed her. If I had not seen the documents from Nevada, the court records, the pattern of predation that stretched back years before she ever met my son, I might have opened my arms and welcomed her back into my life. But I had seen those documents, and as I sat there listening to her apology, I began to notice things that did not quite fit. Her crying was too controlled. Genuine tears are messy, unpredictable, accompanied by the kind of ugly gasping that people try to hide. Lydia's tears flowed at precisely the right moments and stopped when she needed to make an important point. Her mascara ran just enough to look sympathetic, but not enough to make her appear disheveled. It was the crying of someone who had practiced in front of a mirror. Her words were too polished. Real apologies stumble. They backtrack, repeat themselves, search for the right phrases. Lydia's apology flowed like a prepared speech, each sentence building on the last, each emotional beat hitting its mark with theatrical precision. She never hesitated, never corrected herself, never said something, and then wished she could take it back, And twice during pauses in her monologue she glanced at her watch. Quick flicks of the eye, barely perceptible, but I caught them both. She was tracking time. She had somewhere else to be, or perhaps she had calculated exactly how long this performance should last for maximum effect. Either way, it told me everything I needed to know about her sincerity. The most revealing moment came near the end of her apology when she shifted from contrition to concern. She leaned forward, her expression softening into something that was meant to look like worry. She said that at my age, living alone was not safe. She said she and Caleb had been discussing my situation and they were genuinely concerned about my mental state. She said that losing Evelyn had clearly affected me more than anyone realized, and perhaps I was not thinking clearly, not making sound decisions. She framed it as love. She wrapped it in the language of caring family members who only wanted what was best for their elderly father. But I heard what she was actually saying. She was laying groundwork. She was planting seeds for a future argument that I was not competent to make my own decisions, that I needed someone to manage my affairs, that perhaps the legal documents I had sent her were the confused actions of a grieving old man who did not understand what he was doing. It was textbook elder intimidation. I recognized it immediately because I had seen it before in the families I had counseled over my career, in the stories Judith had shared about her cases. This was how it started. First, the suggestion that you were confused, then the implication that you needed help, then eventually the petition to a court claiming that you could no longer take care of yourself. I let her finish without interrupting. When she finally fell silent, I thanked her for coming. I told her I appreciated her honesty. I said I needed time to think about everything she had said. She seemed satisfied with that response. She left the casserole on the table, promised to check on me soon, and walked out the door with the same theatrical grace she had used to enter. The moment her car pulled away from the curb, I stopped the recording and sent the file to Judith. Her response arrived within the hour, a phone call rather than a text, her voice tight with controlled anger. She said what I had captured was textbook intimidation, the references to my mental state, the suggestions that I was not thinking clearly, the implication that my decisions were the product of grief rather than rationality. All of it was documented now, preserved in Lydia's own voice, but Judith said there was more. She had finally tracked down the full story of Lydia's first husband, the widower in Nevada. And what happened to him was exactly what Lydia was trying to do to me. I met Judith at her office the next morning. She had asked me to come in person rather than discuss the matter over the phone, which told me the information she had uncovered was significant enough to require a face-to-face conversation. When I arrived, she had a thick folder waiting on the conference table along with a laptop open to what appeared to be scanned court documents. She did not waste time with pleasantries. She said she had spent the past several days digging into Lydia's background, following threads that led from Colorado to Nevada and back again. What she had found was worse than either of us had anticipated. Lydia was not simply a greedy daughter-in-law who had spotted an opportunity. She was something far more calculated, far more dangerous. 7 years ago, before Lydia ever met my son, she had been married to a man named Gerald Morrison. Gerald was 58 years old at the time, a widower who had lost his wife to cancer 2 years earlier. He owned a modest home in a suburb outside of Reno, had a comfortable retirement fund from his years working as an electrician, and was lonely enough to believe that a beautiful younger woman might genuinely be interested in spending her life with him. Judith slid a photograph across the table. It showed Gerald and Lydia on what appeared to be their wedding day. He was beaming, gray-haired and hopeful, his arm wrapped around a woman who smiled for the camera with practiced warmth. I studied the image and felt a chill run through me. Gerald could have been me. He could have been any of the men I had counseled over the years, any of the widowers who had come to my office seeking advice on how to protect their assets while still being able to live and love again. Within 3 years of the marriage, Judith explained Lydia had systematically dismantled Gerald's life. She convinced him that his adult children were only interested in his money, that they visited out of obligation rather than love, that they spoke poorly of him behind his back. Gerald, desperate to believe that his new wife had his best interests at heart, gradually distanced himself from his son and daughter. By the end of the 2nd year, he had stopped attending family gatherings entirely. Once the children were out of the picture, Lydia moved to the next phase. She persuaded Gerald to add her name to his bank accounts, his investment portfolios, his property deed. She framed it as practical planning, as protection against the unexpected, as proof of their partnership. Gerald, trusting and isolated, signed whatever documents she placed in front of him. The divorce papers were filed in the 3rd year. Lydia cited emotional abuse, claiming that Gerald had become controlling and erratic, that she feared for her safety, that she had no choice but to leave. By the time the case went before a judge, most of Gerald's assets had already been transferred into accounts bearing only Lydia's name. The house was sold, the proceeds divided in a settlement that heavily favored the woman who had orchestrated the entire scheme. Gerald's daughter had tried to intervene. She had seen what was happening, had begged her father to listen, had even attempted to warn others about Lydia after the divorce was finalized. But Lydia had responded with threats of defamation lawsuits, cease and desist letters from attorneys, promises to bury anyone who dared speak against her in legal fees they could not afford. The daughter, already grieving the loss of her relationship with her father, backed down. Gerald died 2 years after the divorce, alone, broken, living in a rented room because he could no longer afford his own home, unable to pay for the medical care that might have extended his life. His daughter found out about his death through a phone call from a stranger who had discovered his body. She still carries the guilt of not fighting harder, of not finding a way to save him before it was too late. I sat in silence as Judith finished recounting the story. The folder in front of me contained court documents, financial records, photographs, and a written statement from Gerald's daughter. Everything was there, documented and verified. This was not speculation or rumor. This was the truth about the woman who had married my son. I finally understood what I was dealing with. Caleb was not the first son Lydia had turned against a father. Gerald's children had been pushed away just as I had been pushed away, made to seem like obstacles rather than family, dismissed and discarded, so that Lydia could have clear access to her target. This was what she did. This was who she was. Not a woman who had made mistakes under stress, not a difficult personality who could be managed with patience, but a predator who selected her victims with care and destroyed them with precision. Judith watched me process this information. When I finally looked up, she spoke again, her voice softer now, but no less serious. She said Evelyn had suspected something like this from the beginning. My wife had sensed that Lydia's interest in our family was not what it appeared to be, had recognized the warning signs that I had been too hopeful to see. Evelyn could not prove it at the time, could not find the evidence that Judith had now uncovered, but her instincts had been correct. That was why she had taken matters into her own hands. That was why she had recorded Lydia herself, capturing words that would have been lost forever if not for her foresight. Judith reached into her briefcase and pulled out the USB drive from Evelyn's safe deposit box. She held it up so I could see the label in my wife's handwriting, the single word that had puzzled me since I first discovered it: insurance. She said there was something I needed to hear. My wife's voice, she explained, from a conversation that took place 3 years ago. Evelyn had known she was dying. She had known she could not protect me forever. So she had created this recording and entrusted it to Judith with instructions to use it only when the time was right. Judith inserted the USB drive into her laptop and turned the screen so we could both see it. There was only one audio file dated 3 years earlier, about 6 months before Evelyn passed. She asked if I was ready. I nodded, though I was not certain that was true. How does anyone prepare to hear the voice of someone they have lost, speaking words they never knew existed? She pressed play. The first sound was the clink of teacups, delicate and familiar. I recognized the china immediately. It was the set Evelyn's mother had given us as a wedding gift, the one with the pale blue flowers around the rim. Evelyn only used it for special occasions or when she wanted to create a particular atmosphere. Hearing that small domestic sound transported me instantly back to our kitchen, to the countless afternoons I had watched her pour tea for guests with the same graceful movements she brought to everything she did. Then her voice came through the speakers, and my chest tightened so suddenly I had to grip the arms of my chair. She sounded tired, but composed, the way she had sounded during those final months when the illness was stealing her strength, but could not touch her dignity. She thanked Lydia for coming. She said she wanted to have a private conversation, just the two of them, about the future. Lydia's response was warm and solicitous, full of the same honeyed concern she had performed in Martha's living room. She said she was happy to talk, that she had been wanting to spend more time with Evelyn, that she wished they had gotten closer sooner. The words were perfect. The tone was perfect. If I had heard this recording without context, I might have believed Lydia genuinely cared. But Evelyn knew better. She guided the conversation with subtle questions, asking what Lydia imagined life would look like in a few years, what plans she and Caleb had been discussing, what she hoped for their future together. And Lydia, believing she was speaking to a dying woman who posed no threat, began to let her mask slip. The shift was gradual at first. Lydia mentioned that she and Caleb had talked about eventually having the house once Arthur no longer needed so much space. She said it casually, as if discussing the weather, as if my displacement from my own home was simply an inevitable step in the natural order of things. Evelyn made a small sound of acknowledgement, neither agreeing nor objecting, and Lydia took this as permission to continue. What came next made my blood run cold. Lydia said that once Evelyn was gone, Arthur would not last long. She said the house would be theirs within a year, maybe two at the outside. She said Caleb would do whatever she told him, because he always did, because she had spent years making sure of that. Her voice had changed completely, now dropping the performative sweetness, becoming something harder and more honest. This was the real Lydia, the one who existed beneath the masks. She laughed then, a sound that scraped against my ears like broken glass. She said I thought I was so smart with my financial planning. She said old men always believed they were clever until they realized they had already lost. The contempt in her voice was absolute, the dismissal of everything I had built and everything I represented. To her, I was nothing but an obstacle between her and what she wanted. Evelyn's voice returned steady despite what she must have been feeling as she listened to this woman reveal her true nature. She asked what would happen if Arthur did not cooperate. The question was gentle, curious, the kind of thing a concerned mother-in-law might ask about practical matters. Lydia's answer came without hesitation. She said if I refused to go along with their plans, they would have me declared incompetent. She said she already had contacts who could help with it, people who understood how the system worked and how to make an old man's resistance look like confusion. She said it would be easy, really, once Evelyn was out of the picture. No one would be left to defend me. The recording ended there. The room fell silent, except for the soft hum of Judith's laptop. I sat without moving for a long time. The tears came quietly, sliding down my cheeks without any sound to accompany them. I was not crying from pain, though there was pain. I was crying because I finally understood the full measure of what my wife had done for me. Evelyn had known she was dying. She had known she would not be there to protect me when Lydia made her move. So she had spent her final months gathering evidence, building defenses, preparing weapons I would not even know existed until I needed them. She had done all of this while her body was failing her, while she was fighting for every breath, while she should have been focused entirely on her own struggle. Instead, she had focused on me. The love in that act was almost unbearable to contemplate. She had carried this knowledge alone, never burdening me with her suspicions, never asking me to choose between believing her and believing in my son's happiness. She had simply done what needed to be done and trusted that Judith would know when the time was right. I wiped my eyes and looked at Judith. She was watching me with an expression that contained both sympathy and something else, something that looked almost like reluctance. She said there was one more thing I needed to know. The recording proved that Lydia had been planning this for years. It documented her intentions in her own voice beyond any possibility of denial or reinterpretation. But Lydia was not the only one who had known what was coming. Judith said my son had discovered what his wife was planning 2 years ago. He had stumbled across evidence of her schemes and had understood exactly what she intended to do. And he had done nothing. He had known all along, and he had chosen silence. The meeting was held at Judith's office 1 week later. She had framed it as a mediation session, an opportunity for all parties to discuss the situation calmly and reach some kind of resolution before things escalated further. The invitation was carefully worded to suggest that I might be open to reconsidering my position, that perhaps the 30-day notice had been issued in haste, that there was still room for compromise. It was, of course, a trap. But Lydia had no way of knowing that. She arrived exactly on time, dressed in a conservative navy suit that made her look almost respectable. Her expression was composed, confident, the face of a woman who believed she was walking into a negotiation she could win. She had probably spent the past week preparing her arguments, rehearsing her appeals to family unity and forgiveness, planning exactly which emotional buttons to push. Caleb came with her, but he looked nothing like his wife. His face was pale and drawn, his eyes shadowed by something that might have been exhaustion or might have been dread. He moved like a man walking toward his own execution, each step heavy with reluctance. He knew something was coming. He didn't know how much. What neither of them expected was the presence of witnesses. Judith had invited my cousin Robert and his wife, who had known our family for decades. She had also asked Martha to attend, along with a colleague from her firm who would serve as an impartial observer. The conference room was fuller than Lydia had anticipated, and I watched her eyes flicker with the first hint of uncertainty as she took in the assembled group. Judith began by thanking everyone for coming. She explained that she had gathered us together because there were matters that needed to be addressed openly with witnesses present, so that no one could later dispute what had been said or shown. Her tone was professional and neutral, giving no indication of what was about to happen. Then she turned on the audio system. The first recording was the one I had made in Martha's living room the day Lydia came to deliver her fake apology. Her voice filled the conference room, trembling with manufactured emotion as she spoke of stress and regret and her desire to honor Evelyn's memory. The witnesses listened politely, uncertain why this was significant. Then the recording reached the part where Lydia's tone shifted, where she began expressing concern about my mental state, where she suggested that living alone was not safe for someone my age, where she implied with careful phrasing that perhaps I was not thinking clearly, that grief had affected my judgment, that the decisions I was making did not reflect the man my family once knew. I watched the witnesses' faces change as they recognized what they were hearing. This was not concern. This was strategy. Lydia was laying groundwork for a competency challenge, planting seeds she intended to harvest later. Lydia's composure began to crack. She opened her mouth to object, but Judith held up a hand and announced there was a second recording, one that would provide important context. This time it was Evelyn's voice that filled the room. I had heard the recording before, but experiencing it again in this setting was different. Surrounded by people who had loved Evelyn, who remembered her grace and her wisdom, hearing her speak from beyond the grave carried a weight that pressed down on everyone present. The room went absolutely still. Lydia's voice followed, captured 3 years ago in a conversation she had believed was private. She spoke of waiting for Evelyn to die. She spoke of taking the house. She spoke of Caleb doing whatever she told him. She laughed about my financial planning and called old men stupid. She discussed having me declared incompetent with contacts who knew how to work the system. Every word was clear. Every sentence was damning. There was no ambiguity, no room for alternative interpretation. Lydia stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. She said the recordings were fake. She said they had been edited, manipulated, created by technology designed to destroy her reputation. She demanded to know how Judith had obtained these files and insisted that using them was illegal. Judith responded with perfect calm. She explained that Colorado was a one-party consent state, meaning that any participant in a conversation could legally record it without informing the other parties. Evelyn had recorded their tea conversation lawfully. I had recorded the apology meeting lawfully. Every word captured on those files was admissible as evidence and had been obtained through entirely legal means. Lydia's face contorted through several emotions in rapid succession: shock, fury, desperation. She spun toward Caleb, who had not moved since the recordings began playing. He sat frozen in his chair, tears streaming silently down his cheeks, his eyes fixed on some point in the middle distance. She screamed at him to say something. She demanded that he defend his wife. She reminded him of everything they had built together, everything they had planned, everything he would lose if he did not stand up for her right now. Caleb did not respond. He did not even seem to hear her. Lydia's voice rose higher, cracking with a rage that stripped away every pretense of the cultured woman she had pretended to be. She accused Caleb of knowing about the recordings. She demanded to know if he had been aware all along, if he had betrayed her, if he had been working against her from the beginning. The room went completely silent. Every eye turned to my son, and for the first time since Christmas dinner, Caleb did not look away from me. His gaze met mine directly, and in his eyes I saw something I had not seen in years: guilt, shame, and beneath it all, the desperate plea of a man who knew he had to finally tell the truth. The silence stretched for what felt like an eternity. Lydia stood frozen mid-accusation, her face twisted with fury and confusion. The witnesses sat motionless, barely breathing, waiting to see what would happen next. And my son, my only child, looked at me with an expression that contained more honesty than I had seen from him in years. When Caleb finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. He said he needed to tell me something. He said he should have told me a long time ago, but he was too much of a coward. He said he was sorry, though he knew that word meant nothing anymore. Lydia started to interrupt, to redirect, to regain control of the situation. But Caleb held up his hand without looking at her. The gesture was so unexpected, so unlike the passive man he had become, that she actually stopped speaking. For perhaps the first time in their marriage, he had silenced her instead of the other way around. He told us what happened 2 years ago, about a night when he came home early from work and found Lydia at her laptop in the study. She had not heard him enter, and he had stood in the doorway for several minutes watching her scroll through websites and take notes. The browser tabs she had open were filled with articles about elder financial abuse, about conservatorship proceedings, about how to have a family member declared mentally incompetent. When he asked what she was doing, she closed the laptop quickly and smiled. She told him it was research for a friend whose father was showing signs of dementia. The friend needed advice on how to protect the family assets before the old man gave everything away to scammers or made foolish decisions. Lydia had been helping her understand the legal options. Caleb said he accepted that explanation. He told himself it made sense that Lydia was just being a good friend, that there was nothing sinister about researching legal processes. But even as he nodded and changed the subject, something cold settled in his stomach. He knew somewhere beneath the excuses he was already constructing that the research had nothing to do with any friend. He never mentioned it again, neither did Lydia. They continued their life as if that night had never happened, and Caleb buried his suspicions beneath layers of rationalization that grew thicker with each passing month. His voice cracked as he tried to explain why he had stayed silent. He said he was afraid of losing her, afraid of losing the life they had built together, the house, the future they had planned. He told himself that I was strong, that I had spent decades helping other people protect themselves, that surely I would figure out what was happening before any real damage was done. He convinced himself that Evelyn's death had simply made Lydia stressed, and that she would return to normal once she finished grieving in her own way. He made excuses every single day. Every time Lydia said something cruel about me, he found a reason to dismiss it. Every time she asked probing questions about my finances, he pretended not to notice. Every time I looked at him with confusion and hurt, wondering why my son had become a stranger, he looked away because the truth was too painful to face. Then he said something that cut through me more deeply than anything else he had confessed. He said the night of Christmas dinner when he told me to shut up, it was not because he was annoyed by my question. It was not because Lydia had trained him to snap at me. It was because he could not bear to look at me anymore. Every time he saw my face, he saw a reflection of what he had become. A coward, a collaborator, a son who had chosen his own comfort over his father's safety. Telling me to shut up was easier than admitting the truth. Driving me away was easier than facing the guilt that had been eating him alive for 2 years. When he finished speaking, the room remained silent. Lydia had stopped trying to intervene. She stood rigid and pale, watching her carefully constructed world collapse around her. The witnesses sat with expressions of shock and pity, unsure where to look or what to say. I let the silence hold for a long moment. I wanted Caleb to feel the weight of it, to understand that confession was not the same as absolution, that speaking the truth did not erase the years of damage his silence had caused. When I finally responded, I kept my voice steady. I told him that his mother would have been heartbroken by what she had just heard. Not because of what Lydia had done. Evelyn had expected that. She had seen the predator beneath the mask long before anyone else, and she had spent her final months preparing for exactly this scenario. No, Evelyn would have been heartbroken because her son knew what was happening and chose to do nothing. Because he watched his father being targeted and decided that his own comfort mattered more than my protection. That was his choice. Not Lydia's manipulation, not fear, not confusion. His choice made freely every single day for 2 years. Caleb's face crumpled. He did not try to defend himself or offer more excuses. He simply sat there, tears streaming down his cheeks, accepting the judgment he had earned. I stood slowly, pushing back my chair. I looked at my son and at the woman he had married, 2 people who had conspired in their own ways to take everything from me. My voice was steady when I spoke. I told them they had 30 days, both of them. The house would return to me as it had always legally belonged to me. What happened after that, whether there was any possibility of rebuilding what they had destroyed, would depend entirely on whether they truly understood what they had done. Not just admitted it, but understood it, felt it, carried it the way I had carried their betrayal. I walked toward the door without waiting for a response. Behind me, I heard Lydia begin shouting again, her voice shrill with accusations and threats. I didn't turn around. Some sounds are not worth acknowledging. Lydia didn't go quietly. I never expected she would. Within a week of the family meeting, she filed a countersuit in county court. The allegations were stunning in their audacity. She claimed I was the abuser, that I had spent years psychologically tormenting her and Caleb, that I had weaponized the legal system to punish my daughter-in-law for imagined slights. She painted herself as a victim of a vindictive old man who could not accept that his son had grown up and chosen his own life. She also contacted the media. A local television station received an anonymous tip about an elderly father using his wealth to destroy his son's marriage. A reporter called Judith's office seeking comment on allegations of family court manipulation. Lydia had clearly studied how to control a narrative, how to get ahead of damaging information by framing herself as the wronged party before anyone could hear the truth. But Judith had anticipated every move. Within days of Lydia's countersuit being filed, Judith responded with a motion to dismiss that included the full documentation of everything we had gathered. The recordings were submitted as evidence. Martha's journal of witnessed cruelties was entered into the record. The property deeds and trust documents were presented to demonstrate the clear and unbroken chain of ownership. Most damaging of all, Judith included the court records from Nevada, the full history of Lydia's first marriage to Gerald Morrison. The story of what Lydia had done to Gerald spread quickly. His daughter, who had lived for years with the guilt of not acting sooner, agreed to provide a sworn statement. She described how Lydia had isolated her father, manipulated him into signing over his assets, and then discarded him once there was nothing left to take. She described finding out about his death through a stranger's phone call. She described the small rented room where he had spent his final days, unable to afford the medical care that might have saved him. When the media outlet that had been preparing a sympathetic story about Lydia received this information, they quietly dropped the piece. No reporter wanted to champion a woman whose pattern of predation was now documented across 2 states. The court hearing was brief. The judge, a silver-haired woman who had clearly seen every variety of family dispute during her decades on the bench, reviewed the evidence with visible impatience. She noted that the recordings were legally obtained under Colorado's one-party consent laws. She observed that the pattern of behavior documented by multiple witnesses was consistent with elder financial exploitation. She pointed out that the property ownership had never been in question and that Lydia's claims of abuse were contradicted by her own recorded words. The countersuit was dismissed with prejudice. Lydia's attorney, a young man who had probably taken the case expecting an easy settlement, withdrew his representation that same afternoon. Word spread through legal circles about what had happened, and no reputable firm in the county would touch her afterward. Her social circle evaporated just as quickly. The friends she had cultivated over the years, the women she had impressed with tales of the beautiful home she would someday inherit, suddenly became unavailable. Invitations stopped arriving. Phone calls went unreturned. The people who had laughed at her jokes about senile old men now pretended they had never known her at all. Moving day arrived on a cold February morning, exactly 30 days after the family meeting. I didn't go to the house to watch. Martha offered to accompany me if I wanted to be there, but I declined. Some victories do not need to be witnessed. Some endings are better observed from a distance. What I learned later came from Martha's network of neighborhood friends. Lydia packed boxes in furious silence, slamming items into cardboard containers with barely controlled rage. She did not speak to anyone who passed by, did not acknowledge the neighbors who had gathered on their porches to watch. Her face was set in a mask of cold fury that made even the moving company workers keep their distance. Caleb moved differently. He handled each item slowly, carefully, as if every object carried weight beyond its physical form. He paused, often staring at things he had owned for years as if seeing them for the first time. The neighbors who watched reported that he looked like a man attending his own funeral, going through motions that no longer held meaning. What Caleb was mourning was not the house. It was not the comfortable life he had grown accustomed to or the future he had imagined. What he had lost was far more significant than property or possessions. He had lost his father. He had lost his integrity. He had lost his mother's faith in him, the knowledge that Evelyn had died hoping her son would become a better man than he had proven to be. The moving truck pulled away in the early afternoon. The house stood empty for the first time in 3 years, waiting for me to decide what to do with it. I was not ready to return yet. The memories there were too complicated, too layered with grief and betrayal and the ghost of my wife. What I did not expect was the knock on Martha's door that evening. Caleb stood on the porch alone. No Lydia beside him, no prepared speech, no agenda. He looked exhausted and hollowed out, a man who had finally stopped running from himself. He asked if he could speak to me. Just for a moment. I stepped onto the porch and waited. He struggled to find words. His hands opened and closed at his sides, his eyes fixed on the ground between us. When he finally managed to speak, his voice was barely audible. He asked if he could come back someday. Not to live, not to reclaim anything he had lost, just to talk. Just to sit with his father again, if such a thing was ever possible after everything that had happened. The question hung in the cold air between us, waiting for an answer that would determine everything that came next. I did not answer Caleb that night on Martha's porch. I told him I needed time, that the wounds were too fresh, that I could not make promises I was not certain I could keep. He nodded slowly, accepting this response as more than he deserved, and walked away into the darkness without looking back. What happened to him in the months that followed, I learned in fragments. What happened to Lydia, I learned in headlines. The divorce papers were filed less than 3 months after they moved out of my house. Lydia did not waste time with pretense or negotiation. Once Caleb was no longer useful to her, once there was no inheritance to chase and no elderly father-in-law to exploit, she discarded him with the same cold efficiency she had applied to Gerald Morrison years before. The proceedings were swift and brutal. She took what little they had accumulated together and left Caleb with nothing but the wreckage of his choices. She moved out of state almost immediately, relocating to Arizona, where she apparently believed her past could not follow. She was wrong. The internet has a long memory, and Gerald Morrison's daughter had spent years waiting for the opportunity to tell her story. Her name was Patricia. She contacted the journalist who had originally investigated Lydia's countersuit against me, the same reporter who had quietly dropped the sympathetic piece when the truth emerged. Patricia provided interviews, documents, photographs. She described in devastating detail how Lydia had systematically destroyed her father, isolating him from everyone who loved him, draining his accounts, and then abandoning him to die alone in a rented room he could barely afford. The story ran as part of a larger feature on elder financial abuse. Lydia was not named directly in the broadcast version, but the newspaper article included enough identifying details that anyone searching her name would find it. Her photograph appeared alongside statistics about predatory marriages and warnings about the tactics used by people who target vulnerable seniors. Patricia's tearful interview was viewed hundreds of thousands of times. Lydia attempted to rebuild regardless. She had done it before, after all. She had walked away from Gerald Morrison and found Caleb within 2 years. She knew how to present herself, how to identify targets, how to craft the perfect persona for lonely men seeking companionship in their later years. She found one in Tucson, a 71-year-old widower named Robert, whose wife had passed the previous spring. He had a comfortable home, a modest pension, and the kind of trusting nature that made him perfect prey. Lydia met him through a community center event, positioned herself as a sympathetic listener, and began the slow process of integration that had worked so well before. But Robert had a daughter named Christine who lived nearby and visited often. Christine was protective of her father, suspicious of sudden new friendships, and diligent about staying informed. When Lydia's name came up in conversation, Christine did what any cautious daughter would do in the modern age. She searched online. The news articles appeared immediately. Patricia Morrison's interview, the court documents from Colorado, the pattern of behavior documented across 2 states and multiple victims. Christine recognized the warning signs instantly and confronted her father before Lydia could establish deeper control. Robert, shaken but grateful, ended contact with Lydia immediately. Christine went further. She filed a report with local authorities and contacted Patricia Morrison directly. Together, they compiled a comprehensive account of Lydia's history and submitted it to investigators in Nevada who had long suspected there was more to Gerald Morrison's financial collapse than a contentious divorce. The statute of limitations on fraud charges varies by state and circumstance. Some of Gerald's losses fell outside the window, but not all of them. Lydia found herself facing criminal charges for the first time in her life, accused of the systematic exploitation she had practiced with impunity for nearly a decade. The last update I received about her came from Judith, who maintained contacts in legal circles across several states. Lydia was living in a small apartment in a desert town whose name I did not recognize. She had been released on bail pending trial, but was required to remain in the jurisdiction. Her assets, what few remained after legal fees, had been frozen. The social circle she had once cultivated had long since evaporated. The friends, the admirers, the people who had been impressed by her charm and sophistication had all discovered who she really was and wanted nothing to do with her. Judith said Lydia spent most of her time alone now, checking her phone compulsively for responses to dating profiles that generated no interest. The photographs she posted were years old. The descriptions she wrote were transparently desperate. The men she had once targeted with such precision now scrolled past her without a second glance. She had built her entire life on exploiting lonely old people. Now she was becoming exactly what she had preyed upon: isolated, desperate, invisible, aging in a small room with no one to notice and no one to care. There was a justice in that symmetry more complete than any prison sentence could provide. I tried not to think about her too often. Revenge, even justified revenge, can become a poison if you drink too deeply from it. Evelyn had warned me about that in one of her letters, reminding me that the goal was protection, not destruction. I'd protected myself. I'd protected others who might have become her future victims. What happened to Lydia now was simply the natural consequence of a life built on cruelty. 6 months after the eviction, a letter arrived at my house. I had finally returned by then, slowly reclaiming the space that had once belonged to Evelyn and me together. The envelope was plain, the handwriting familiar. The return address was Caleb's, an apartment in a part of the city I did not know well. Inside was a single photograph. It showed Caleb at what appeared to be a volunteer center, surrounded by elderly residents helping someone in a wheelchair navigate through a doorway. His expression was tired, but present, engaged in the moment, rather than lost in the distance I had grown accustomed to seeing in his eyes. Below the photograph were 3 words written in my son's hand. 3 words that carried the weight of everything he could not yet say but was trying to learn. 3 words that were not an apology, not a request for forgiveness, but something simpler and perhaps more honest. I'm still trying. I kept the photograph on my desk for 3 weeks before I responded. Every morning I looked at it while drinking my coffee, studying my son's face, searching for signs of the man I had raised before Lydia reshaped him into someone I barely recognized. The exhaustion was still there, visible in the shadows beneath his eyes. But there was something else too. A presence, an engagement with the world around him that I had not seen in years. When I finally called him, I suggested we meet at Evelyn's grave. It was neutral ground in the truest sense, sacred ground, a place where neither of us could hide behind walls or pretend that the past had not happened. Evelyn deserved to be part of this conversation, even if she could only listen from beneath the earth. Caleb was already there when I arrived. He stood before his mother's headstone, with his hands at his sides, his head bowed, his lips moving in what might have been prayer, or might have been the private confession of a son who had failed the woman who gave him life. He did not look up when he heard my footsteps on the gravel path. He simply waited, giving me the choice of how close to stand. I stopped beside him close enough to speak without raising my voice far enough that we were not touching. We stood together in silence for several minutes, reading the words carved into marble. Beloved wife and mother, a light that never fades. Evelyn had chosen that phrase herself during one of our final conversations about arrangements neither of us wanted to make. When Caleb finally spoke, his voice was nothing like Lydia's polished performance in Martha's living room. It cracked and stumbled. It paused in the middle of sentences while he searched for words that would not come. Tears interrupted him more than once, and he did not try to hide them or apologize for their presence. He told me about the therapy he had started, about the divorce that had become final 2 months earlier, about the volunteer work at the Elder Care Center where he spent 3 days a week helping people who reminded him of everything he had almost helped destroy. He said he had listened to their stories, learned their names, heard about the children who visited and the children who did not. He said he understood now in a way he could not have understood before what it meant to be old and vulnerable and dependent on people who might not have your best interests at heart. Then he said something that made me finally turn and look at him directly. He said he was not there to be forgiven. He was not asking me to pretend the past had not happened or to embrace him as though the wounds had already healed. He said he knew that forgiveness, if it ever came, would take years to earn and might never be complete. He was there for a simpler reason. He wanted me to know he was trying. He wanted to become someone his mother would not be ashamed of. That was all. That was enough. I listened without interrupting. When he finished, I took a slow breath and considered how to respond. The easy thing would have been to embrace him, to tell him all was forgiven, to pretend that this single conversation could undo years of silence and complicity. Movies end that way. Greeting cards promise that kind of resolution. But real life is messier than movies, and real healing takes longer than a single afternoon. I told him that forgiveness was not a gift I could give him. It was not something I could hand over like a present and then watch him unwrap. Forgiveness was something he would have to earn through how he lived his life going forward. Through every choice he made every day, he showed up for the people who needed him. Every time he chose courage over convenience. I told him I would not close the door. The path back was open, and he was welcome to walk it. But the walking was his responsibility. He would have to rebuild the trust himself, one honest day at a time, with no guarantee that the destination would look like what he hoped for. Caleb nodded slowly. He did not argue or try to extract promises I was not ready to make. He simply accepted the boundary I had set and thanked me for keeping the door open at all. We stood together for another moment, looking at Evelyn's name carved in stone. Then, without discussion, we began walking toward the cemetery entrance. Not side by side, not arm in arm, but moving in the same direction. It was not reconciliation. It was the possibility of reconciliation. A first step on a road that neither of us could see the end of. As we walked, I felt something shift in my coat pocket. A piece of paper I had forgotten was there. I reached in and pulled out a small envelope yellowed with age, bearing handwriting I would recognize anywhere. Evelyn's script. Another letter. One final message I had somehow overlooked in the chaos of the past months. I waited until I was home to open the envelope. Some words are too precious to read in public, too intimate to share with even the empty space of a cemetery. I sat in the kitchen, where Evelyn and I had shared 40 years of morning coffee and evening conversations, and I carefully broke the seal she had pressed closed with her own hands. The letter inside was shorter than the others. Her handwriting was weaker here, the lines less steady, and I realized this must have been written very close to the end. She had saved her final words for the moment when I would need them most, trusting that Judith or Martha or simple fate would ensure they reached me at the right time. She began by telling me she loved me, not as a pleasantry or a formality, but as a statement of absolute truth that she wanted to be the first thing I read. Then she continued with words that felt like her hand reaching across the divide between life and death to rest gently on my shoulder. She wrote that if I was reading this letter, then everything she had feared had come true. The schemes she had sensed, the danger she had prepared for, the betrayal she had hoped would never materialize. But it also meant that everything she had prepared had worked. The documents, the recordings, the network of people watching over me. Her protections had held. I had survived what Lydia tried to do. She apologized for not being able to protect me while she was alive. She said she had wanted to tell me everything, to warn me directly, to stand beside me and face the threat together. But she had known that her suspicions would sound like jealousy or paranoia, that without proof I would dismiss her concerns, and the resulting conflict might drive Caleb away entirely. So she had chosen a different path. She had built defenses I would not discover until I needed them, trusting that I would find my way to the truth when the time was right. Then she wrote something that made me set the letter down and weep. She said that death did not end love. It only changed how we showed it. She had loved me for over 4 decades while she was alive, and she would continue loving me for as long as my heart kept beating. Every protection she had put in place, every document and recording and whispered instruction to trusted friends was an expression of that love. She was still taking care of me. She would always be taking care of me. The final paragraph was the one I read most carefully. She told me that whatever I chose now, forgiveness or distance, justice or mercy, she supported me completely. There was no right answer. There was only the answer that allowed me to live with peace in my heart. But she asked me to promise her one thing. She asked me not to become bitter. Bitterness, she wrote, was the revenge that hurt the wrong person. It was a poison you drank hoping someone else would suffer. She did not want that for me. She wanted me to find a way forward that honored the life we had built together rather than destroying it in pursuit of punishment. I kept that promise. In the months that followed, I returned to the house that had been ours together and began opening it in new ways. I hosted dinners for neighbors who had watched my struggle from a distance and wanted to offer support. I invited Martha over regularly, and our friendship deepened into something that felt almost like family. I started volunteering at the same senior center where Caleb worked, though we kept different schedules at first. I helped elderly residents recognize the warning signs of financial exploitation, sharing my story so that others might avoid the pain I had experienced. I donated to organizations that protected vulnerable adults. I wrote letters to legislators about strengthening elder abuse laws. I turned my pain into purpose, channeling the grief and anger into something constructive, rather than letting it curdle into the bitterness Evelyn had warned me against. 1 year after the eviction, I sat on my porch watching the Colorado sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and rose. The evening air was cool and clean, carrying the scent of pine from the forests to the west. I had a cup of tea in my hands and a blanket across my lap, and I felt something I had not felt in a very long time. Contentment. Caleb visited sometimes now, not often, not easily, but honestly. Our conversations were different than they had been before. We were not father and dependent son anymore. We were two adults, learning to know each other, discovering who we each were becoming, rather than clinging to who we had been. I no longer waited for him to return to the boy I had raised. That boy was gone, shaped by choices that could not be unmade. Instead, I watched to see who he was growing into now, and some days I saw glimmers of something that gave me hope. The chair beside me was empty. It had been Evelyn's chair, the place where she would sit with me on summer evenings, watching the light fade while we talked about everything and nothing. I had not moved it. I had not replaced it. It remained exactly where she had left it, a reminder of the presence that would never fully leave this porch. I turned toward that empty chair and spoke softly into the evening air, knowing that somehow, somewhere she could hear me. I told her she was right. The best revenge was not making them suffer. The best revenge was making sure their suffering did not become mine. I had walked away from that Christmas table with my dignity intact. I had reclaimed my home, my independence, my sense of self. I had refused to let their cruelty transform me into someone unrecognizable. I smiled, feeling the warmth of her memory beside me. Walking away, I said, was the bravest thing I ever did, and coming back on my own terms was even braver. The sun slipped below the mountains, and the first stars began to appear. I sat in the growing darkness at peace with the life I had built from the ruins of betrayal, grateful for the love that had protected me even from beyond the grave, and that is how I learned that the quietest revenge is often the most powerful. I did not scream or threaten or lower myself to the tactics of those who tried to destroy me. I simply walked away from a table where I was not respected, and I let the truth do what truth always does when given enough time. It rises. It exposes. It delivers justice more complete than any confrontation could provide. Lydia built her life on exploiting lonely old men, and now she sits alone in a small apartment invisible to the world she once manipulated so effortlessly. Caleb lost everything he thought he wanted, but in that loss he found the chance to become someone worthy of the mother who loved him. And I found peace not through bitterness or vengeance, but through the simple act of reclaiming my dignity and refusing to let their cruelty define my remaining years. If you are watching this and you recognize something familiar in my story, if someone in your life is treating you the way Lydia treated me, I want you to know that you are not powerless. You are not too old to fight back. You are not alone. There are people who will believe you, support you, and help you protect what you have built. Thank you for staying with me until the end. If this story touched your heart or reminded you of someone you love, please share it with them. Leave a comment below and tell me your thoughts. Have you ever had to walk away from family to save yourself? I want to hear your story. Subscribe to this channel so you never miss another video. And remember, sometimes the bravest thing you can do is simply stand up, take your keys, and walk out the door.